What's up, everybody? How's it going, Maddie?
It's going really well. How are you?
Oh my gosh, I'm doing fantastic. I'm so excited to chat with you. There's been some pretty wild updates going on in the world of nutrition policy with, all the meetings from the dietary guidelines over the past few years. But then things have kind of gotten a little complicated with this new dietary guidelines reform bill that got recently introduced back in March. So I'm really excited to have you on to chat about it, to get to learn about it, and just share like what are the dietary guidelines? Well, how does this bill impact it? Why do we need a reform? So maybe you want to start off by introducing yourself?
Sure. My name is Maddy Bennett, and I am the Senior Lead of Nutrition Science and Policy at Balanced. My background is in nutrition science and food policy, and I do a little bit of policy and science communications for Balanced.
Right on. And now, what does that look like in a day-to-day process? Like, is this the most important thing that we need to be worried about? The Dietary Guideline Reform Act of 2025? Like, can you kind of like describe like the realm of food policy and what that looks like?
Yeah, the scope of food policy is huge. I typically focus more on school nutrition, and my day to day at the moment is more research focused than sort of doing a deep dive into policy. Um, but yeah, this is a pretty interesting development from the current administration, and I have some concerns about where it's going, but we can definitely jump into that as we talk about it.
Yeah, and getting to the foundation of it, like our whole world at Balance is nutrition security. We want to make sure that we're changing menus and saving lives. And one of the things that we talk about continually in our work is food environment. And food environment is just what the food options look like on a day to day. You go to the grocery store, what's available? You're at a school lunch cafeteria, what's being served? You're in an office, what's being served, hospital, etc. It's the choices that we don't get to make that shape what food options we have available. And for many policymakers, the nutrition or the dietary guidelines for Americans are really impactful. They're sort of what shapes that food environment. So could you explain like what the dietary guidelines for Americans are and why they matter?
Sure. So the dietary guidelines are an expansive resource filled to the brim with public health nutrition information and guidance, and it's used by policymakers to help them develop and evaluate federal nutrition policy. So over the years, the Dietary Guidelines for Americans document has evolved from something more consumer facing to something more policy professional facing. And it really serves as a nutrition science touchstone for those who craft food policy and also for those who have clients or patients that they need to advise on nutrition. And so, its current form, it's not really designed to be comprehensible to the average American. But the reason that the dietary guidelines are so important is because they undergird a lot of the nutrition assistance programs that we have. So think SNAP, WIC, the National School Lunch Program, the School Breakfast Program. So the dietary guidelines impact the people who use these programs insofar as the dietary guidelines tend to influence how these programs make certain foods accessible or inaccessible.
Gotcha. Because when I've been hearing about it, I was thinking like, what are the dietary guidelines? And until I really got into like the nutrition food space, it is never something that was I was aware of. I always thought of like the food pyramid or my plate being the standard things that people look to for like this is what I should be eating. Here's how much veggies I should get per day. This percent of my plate should be protein, something like that. So like why is it now that the dietary guidelines are sort of being viewed as this public awareness campaign? Like and what's the difference? Am I right in understanding the difference between those two?
Yeah, no, you're definitely right about that. So my plate is more targeted toward a general audience, a lay audience, the American public, whereas the DGAs are geared toward policymakers and professionals who work in food policy or in public health more generally. I think the reason why it's become kind of like a cultural battleground or political battleground in the broader culture wars um, is that there are some people out in like the podcasting universe who have kind of latched onto this idea that the dietary guidelines are some kind of like vehicle for um, agriculture, like big ag and big food influence over what Americans eat. So they've latched onto it and they think that it's like what is driving obesity and type 2 diabetes and other chronic health conditions in the American population. But as we'll see in this conversation, it really is not as impactful as people think it is.
Right, because there's a ton of talk right now around ultra processed foods. I know schools, districts across the country are banning artificial dyes and synthetic food colorings, and there's it's massive like renaissance of discussion around what is ultra processing, what is healthy, a lot of conflict in the science, and like I think of folks like my mom or my sister who are not as plugged in and are very confused by a lot of the stuff going into this. So who decides what's going into the dietary guidelines? Like, from what I'd understood, it's a thing that changes like every 5 years. A bunch of people submit public insight, and you have people from nonprofit space, doctors, you have food industry folks, and they're all providing insights with the latest research to help shape and craft them. Is that right? Is that who decides the dietary guidelines?
So there are two groups of people that I would say are influencing the dietary guidelines or writing the dietary guidelines. So you have the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, which is a panel of 20 experts, scientists in different fields. So it could be nutrition, epidemiology, could be a physician, um, anyone with public health or health expertise can participate on this panel. And so there are 20 of them, right? And the way that these members are selected is there's a nomination process. So a call for nominations, you have to put together an application and submit it for review to the secretaries of Health and Human Services and the Department of Agriculture. And so ultimately, they are the ones who appoint the 20 individuals who become part of this panel. And then what they do over a period of several years is they review the science. And along the way, there are opportunities for public engagement. So there are comment periods, there are public meetings that anyone can attend. And then at the end of that, they produce a scientific report, which they then submit to HHS and USDA. And it's actually staffers within the USDA and HHS who end up writing the final dietary guidelines. So the panel, the DGAC, the committee, they're the ones responsible for evaluating the science and making sure that the best available science is summarized and can be used then by staffers within USDA and HHS to interpret that information and decide what ultimately their peers in the policymaking world are going to read.
Gotcha. And I know in the past, like Audrey, who's the executive director of Balance, had submitted public statement. Like we got this really fun video because it's all documented. Like you get to see who these folks are, and the videos are available online. You can go to whatever website it is. I don't know, like hhs.gov or whatever, and see the public testimony on the dietary guidelines. So the idea that it's sort of like this hidden cabal of people who are, like able to provide insight on it is on the one hand not true because you get to see, who's providing insights, but what percent of those comments actually make it into the recommendations? So we noticed like a disconnect between the public comment part of this and what actually ends up in the guidelines.
Yeah, I'm not totally sure because I don't exactly know how they incorporate comments. What I know is that the systematic review process is very rigorous. And yeah, I'm sure they're taking comments into consideration. And the other thing that I want to say is that, these members who are scientists and who care deeply about public health and about reality in general, they are subject to an ethics review and disclosure of conflicts of interest in the same way that like federal employees are subject to disclosure and ethics rules. So yeah, just to like impress upon viewers and listeners, Um, that this is a group of people who are like very dedicated to public health, and they're not just like captured by industry or shilling for industry, as some people seem to believe.
Yeah, because there is this sort of like conspiracy theorist type person who thinks, everything's being controlled and manipulated, and these people are like paid individuals that are getting these positions. And, I mean, and I think that the core part of this is because you mentioned like we don't know how much of that public comment actually gets in. We see like nutrition science in a casual setting, but we don't often see it reflected in dietary guidelines. And it seems like there's always sort of like this lag between what the nutrition science is saying and what actually ends up making it into the guidelines. Um, do the guidelines really reflect like the best available nutrition science? Because there's a ton of skepticism. Like I go on social media and I look at all the different advice, and you have these people who are really confidently saying like X, Y, and Z, and then you swipe a little more, and then you see, oh, A, B, and C is true, not X, Y, and Z is true, and then you look at an article saying A, B, and Z is not true. So for the average person, it is incredibly confusing. Do the guidelines really reflect like the most available research?
In short, I would say yes, the dietary guidelines do generally reflect nutrition science pretty well. The most recent iteration, which is the 2020 to 2025 dietary guidelines, was published December of 2020. And although when I read over those guidelines when they came out, and I noticed that I felt like there was plenty of room for improvement, it would be incorrect to say that the guidelines aren't scientifically valid. Um, I would just add that the field of nutrition is pretty young, and it's been evolving pretty rapidly as well. Especially nutrition epidemiology is, something that's only really become a field unto itself in the last like 30 to 40 years. Um, so yeah, I mean that that evidence is increasingly a part of the dietary guidelines review, and the more science accumulates, the more we can get clarity over like what should be in the dietary guidelines. And that's why the cycle is every 5 years, the dietary guidelines are updated. Um,
Yeah, and the dietary guidelines have only been around since like the 80s, right?
yeah, the first one was published in 1980. It was only like 19 pages long, and it was more of a brochure than anything else. And it was, I think, entirely consumer facing at that point.
Wow, that was like 8 years before I was born. So like to think like this is all like a relatively modern thing. So in the scope of these folks who are, say in their 50s, 60s, 70s, they got to see this entire process. They got to see, from start of creation to, here we are now, and see the evolution of how they've changed. So I'm just curious, like with this reform bill that a lot of policymakers are advocating for now, like why is it needed now, and what does this reform bill really do?
So the reform bill is called the Dietary Guidelines Reform Act of 2025, and it was introduced in both the House and the Senate separately, but in coordination between Republican lawmakers Senator Roger Marshall from Kansas and Representative Ronnie Jackson from Texas. And this legislation is kind of part of the broader Make America Healthy Again agenda, or the MAHA movement, spearheaded by RFK Jr., who is our HHS secretary. So what this bill would do is enact some pretty major changes to the original legislation that established the dietary guidelines process. So, like specifically, it would change the cycle to every 10 years. The DGA will be updated every 10 years or as needed, and it's not clear how that's defined. Um, One of the things that I actually found most concerning about this bill is how it establishes a so-called independent advisory board of up to 8 members, and these would be highly like partisan appointees who, it's unclear what the criteria are for how they're chosen, but it's supposed to be an equal balance of Republican and Democratic representation. But what it's doing essentially is injecting politics directly into this otherwise like very apolitical process. So, I really don't see the value in adding something like that. I guess there are other stipulations within the bill that could like ostensibly increase transparency, but as we've already mentioned, there's already a high level of rigor and ethics review and disclosure of conflict of interest. It's just that those conflicts of interest aren't necessarily made public to general Americans. But yeah, I don't know. I didn't find anything to be like all that impressive or revolutionary about this bill other than the fact that it injects politics needlessly into what should be an apolitical process.
Yeah, and then it gets back to that initial thing that we were talking about having like industry insiders, because there's the industry to politics pipeline, and folks who have worked in industry then getting positions in government and then getting into these various departments to make changes in favor of that industry. Definitely runs the risk of that, because you mentioned like this panel of 20 scientists who are appointed by the DHHS and the Department of Agriculture. They're thoroughly vetted. Is there any vetting process outlined in this bill for these folks that are going to be a part of this independent advisory committee?
Um, Honestly,
Or is it just kind of like they just get picked? Like, because like I'm looking here at a little bit more detailed, and it's like, okay, they're just directly appointed by the secretaries of the USDA and HHS. So it's kind of like, let me pick my buddies.
right. So like whichever party is in power, they get to pick the secretaries of HHS and USDA get to both pick their appointees. So that would be 4 total for the reigning party. And then for the ranking members, so the non-dominant party at the moment, they would be the ones selecting the other 4 members of this panel. And that would be done by the ranking members of different committees. So like the Committee on Ag, Nutrition, and Forestry, and also the Committee on Health, Ed, and Labor in the Senate, and then the committees for Agriculture, Energy, and Commerce in the House of Representatives. So in that way, it would just be a balance, but there's no like criteria set out for like who these people can be and what kind of expertise they should have and whether or not they can or cannot be independent from industry.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So, you know, why is this reform bill, needed now? Like, if the dietary guidelines are something that only appeals to like policymakers and those who are crafting like nutrition policy, like has it been so broken that a reform is really needed, or is this just kind of like an attempt to gain power and create um just, I don't know, industry favorable conditions for nutrition guidelines? Like, I just don't understand why a reform is needed right now.
Yeah, I don't think that reform is actually like the most pressing issue, and it's definitely not going to be something that's transformative of the average American's health. So, I mean, the funny thing is that the most non-transparent part of the DGA process is actually the part that we're in currently, which is when the DGAC hands off the scientific report to the USDA and HHS, and staffers at HHS and USDA write the final Dietary Guidelines for Americans report. It's not clear who is actually doing the writing, right? Like
Okay.
the authors within USDA and HHS are not disclosed until the guidelines are published. And, if there's anything you should know about USDA, it's that they are beholden to American agricultural producers. So there's an inherent conflict of interest there between, being really stringent about putting the best nutrition science forward, but also like not pulling the rug out from underneath pork producers or, the beef industry, for example. So there's an inherent tension there that I think compromises the USDA specifically.
Gotcha. Because, and like, I always think, like, we focus on nutrition security so much and making sure that, like, the food environments for kids who are in school, like the 30 million kids who are consuming these meals, does this reform really benefit those children? Like, if we were to really objectively look at it, like, is this going to ultimately result in school cafeteria trays being more nutritious? Because previously, we'd seen, 97% of kids being fiber deficient. Ultra processed foods are rampant in schools. We see rates of childhood illness, dramatically rising. And if the previous DGAs had been resulting in these impacts, I can definitely understand the argument for a potential reform and figuring it out. Is this going to make the lives of kids better?
I don't believe that this is going to improve school meals, nutrition, or child health in any way. Yeah, I mean, it's pretty clear from the language coming from our HHS Secretary Kennedy that he is driven by ideology and vibes and not necessarily science.
Uh-huh.
So, and like here at Balanced, we have actually advocated for school meals to be more in line with the dietary guidelines because, in fact, the dietary guidelines are stricter than the school nutrition standards. So, a great example of that is, you know, the dietary guidelines say to limit added sugars. And for a long time, there was absolutely no limit on added sugars in school meals until last year when the USDA said, you know what, you're right. The DGA say limit added sugars to below 10% of calories. And so they added that new stipulation within their rule. So, that's a great example of actually how the DGAs have kind of grounded and improved school nutrition over the years. That's not to say, though, that there isn't plenty of room for improvement, because there definitely is. And you highlighted ultra processed foods as being one of those things that kind of has slipped underneath the radar screen for a very long time. And that's definitely something that we should address. But I don't really see how degrading the DGA process itself and needlessly politicizing it is going to improve the dietary guidelines and thus improve school nutrition and child health.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, we want, the healthiest options available. We want food environments that promote well-being, that do not promote harm. Because growing up for me, school lunch was effectively like Bosco sticks, pizza, French fries, things that, like, might be tasty to someone who isn't really caring about like nutrition security or making sure that they have most nutritious food. But because the food is so unappetizing, there are many kids who are simply opting out completely. Many parents who are simply packing their own lunch. They're paying for this product, the National School Lunch Program, through our tax dollars, which they're just not participating in. So you get this like low reduction in participation rates. And for those who are in most need, like with so many kids, the lunch that's provided, it could be the only meal that they get that day. Things like the National School Lunch Program and breakfast program are really important for not only providing food security, but also that nutrition security element. And we need to make sure that those who are most vulnerable are not the most impacted by the lack of adherence to the dietary guidelines. So you can spend all this time and energy, get public comment, but if the institutions aren't following the guidelines in the first place, then why does any of this matter? So, like, not really like a question, but just kind of like venting a general frustration with the process, because why do we need a reform for something that no one follows anyways? But is that right? Like, how do the dietary guidelines impact average Americans, like families and children?
I would say the vast majority of Americans are not impacted in any meaningful way by the dietary guidelines. It's mainly those who are using nutrition assistance programs or who participate in the National School Lunch Program, School Breakfast Program, SNAP, WIC, CACFP, which is for children and adults with special needs. There's also like federal food service guidelines that are based upon the dietary guidelines, and DoD, military food service, and military nutrition guidelines, nutrition education materials, My Plate. And, to what extent does the average American consult My Plate? The average American is not adhering to the dietary guidelines. And we know that because there's something called the Healthy Eating Index, which essentially measures how closely a person's diet reflects the dietary guidelines. And the adherence is 50%. So, but we do know that eating a diet more in line with the dietary guidelines is associated with better health outcomes overall. Getting back to school meals, you're right. I think there are definitely a lot of issues around food quality and around funding for these programs. I mean, at the end of the day, I don't think, major changes to the dietary guidelines are the biggest threat to these programs. I think it's the pulling of funding, which, is being championed by certain members of Congress. And that is going to be much more devastating to vulnerable populations who are beneficiaries of these programs. And I would also add that more eminently, the threat to school meals is actually one-off legislation, again, coming from Congress, who has essentially no experts in child nutrition. But, they are being goaded and encouraged by the dairy industry, for example, to create the Whole Milk for Healthy Kids Act, which has been, kind of floating in the ether for the last few years. They've been trying to get carve-outs for whole milk and for cheese so that the saturated fat content of dairy products does not contribute to the overall calculation and cap on saturated fat in school meals. And so that would dramatically increase the amount of saturated fat in school meals. So I would say, the bigger threat at the moment is not the threats against the dietary guidelines process, but actually just coming from Congress itself. I mean, at least the USDA, there are actual experts within USDA. Congress is entirely, shooting from the hip, kind of going rogue here and circumventing the more traditional process of allowing the experts within USDA to handle school nutrition. But again, even the USDA isn't perfect, but still more appropriate than members of Congress trying to pass one-off legislation for, the dairy industry or any other industry.
Yeah, and I think what you mentioned there with sort of going rogue and this being unconventional times for the way that things traditionally happen with regards to policy and with regards to government. So many different areas that are being impacted by this lack of formality and lack of tradition and process. And with regards to this reform, which is highly untraditional, with regards to how the dietary guidelines are traditionally put together. Who's supporting this reform? Are there folks that are actively resisting it? Can we do anything about it?
So I would say there really hasn't been too much coverage of this reform bill. But in my research, I've actually seen a lot of support, mainly coming from agricultural producers. So, press releases coming from the pork industry or the beef industry. And the reason why they support this is because they understand that this is undermining an apolitical, strictly scientific process. The science does not support eating more red meat and more processed meat. It is the exact opposite. And so we should pause and reflect on why it is that these industries are seeing this as an opening to inject, basically, I don't know if propaganda is the right word, but to improve the odds of getting, an okay from the federal government to eat more meat and more red meat specifically. And I guess that they see that as a win for them. Um, yeah, I don't know that I haven't seen like any like average American being like, oh, thank God someone's finally reforming the dietary guidelines process. I mean, most Americans have no idea what it even entails. So I think it's interesting that it's mainly certain agricultural producers and certain industries that are supporting it. And, on the other hand, it is organizations like Balanced or like Center for Science in the Public Interest and other allied organizations who are speaking out against, changes to the dietary guidelines process because we understand that it has the potential to undermine the scientific integrity of this process, and that in turn can lead to just general degradation of our shared sense of reality and policy making that flows from that reality.
Totally. And I've even seen like the Center Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine putting out petition trying to raise awareness about rejecting the Dietary Guidelines Reform Act that's going on. For you personally, like you dedicate so much of your time and energy towards policy, towards researching this. What sort of drives that passion and that interest? You're incredibly knowledgeable about all these things. You have your finger on the pulse of all these different tangential things going on, and really can like synthesize the network of interactions and distill it down into something that's really easily understandable. It's just something I really appreciate you. What would you say is behind that passion and that interest?
I think my passion stems from at least in this moment, from a sense of defiance. I really care a lot about, living in the same shared reality. And I think we have a lot of really serious problems that cause a lot of suffering and that will cause a lot of future suffering related to food systems. And if we can't accurately diagnose what the problem is, then we can't fix the problem and we can't come up with the right solutions. So I think being annoyed with people who think that they're experts, I think that drives me in this work, and it's why I continue to refine my own understanding of nutrition and public health, and why, I try to be as humble as I can, because I know I've been wrong so many times, but the difference is you have to be able to admit when you're wrong and do better the next time. And, I'm just not getting that from the current administration. They seem, again, to be driven more by politics and ideology than they are reality and science and rationality.
Yeah, totally. So if you were at the helm of crafting dietary guidelines, someone's like, Maddie, you got the key. All right, here's their pen. You're writing the dietary guidelines. What things that you would change today that would most help kids? Thinking about like what Balance focuses on, which is nutrition security, typically K through 12 institutions, and really making sure that menus are as healthy and nutritious as possible. What would you change to make sure that that happened?
I think the most impactful change to the dietary guidelines would be promoting plant-based proteins, and, not exclusively, but I would say as a proportion of calories, they're far lower than they ought to be. So I would really like to see a change like that reflected in the school nutrition standards. Like imagine if half of all of the entrees served in schools contained a plant-based protein, a fiber-rich plant-based protein. I think, the dietary guidelines and the school nutrition standards do a pretty good job of promoting whole grains. I think it could be better. I think they do an okay job of promoting fruit and vegetable consumption, although I think it could be better. But I think, yeah, like the missing piece for me is more plant-based proteins, center of plate. That's what I would like to see. And as far as the dietary guidelines process itself goes, I would really like to see USDA take more of a backseat role because, like I said, there's sort of this inherent conflict of interest there, um, promoting animal agriculture at the same time that they should be telling people to scale back their consumption of red and processed meat. Um, so yeah, I'd like to see that change, and maybe we can get the former when we get the latter first. but we'll see.
Totally. Yeah. Because like every month we put out our balanced fiber guide, which highlights all of the fruits and veggies that are in season, how much fiber they have. And more often than not, we see pretty high protein content within plants and high fiber content. Things like beans, lentils, peas are all really top notch and just fantastic to incorporate into dishes. So, how often are those types of foods being incorporated into the dietary guidelines saying like, let's eat more beans or, let's get some like lentil type food onto a lunch tray? Like, do we see those being incorporated more nowadays? Because for me growing up, I just didn't see those on the plate. Like, was that a function of the dietary guidelines why I didn't see those things?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, yes, it is sort of a function of the dietary guidelines, but I think also school nutrition standards have not always seamlessly adhered to the dietary guidelines, and they continue to not fully adhere to the dietary guidelines. What's really interesting about the most recent Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, which just, basically wrapped up their work um, earlier this year and last year, is that in their scientific report, they stressed consuming more plant-based proteins. And that is a change that I would love to see the current administration adopt right now as they're writing the dietary guidelines. Do I think that will happen? No. But I would really like to see that happen because that would actually be a really beneficial change and that could have a positive impact on school nutrition standards and on child health.
And so often I hear that, a child's health is like the parent's responsibility. It's up to the parent to make sure. And like as a parent myself, like I can tell you, we do our best. We're trying. But when our kids are going to school and they have no choice over what's on that menu, it can feel a bit like disempowering for the average person to see any change. And as you're talking about like policymakers being involved and those who don't necessarily have the appropriate scientific background being put into positions of power who are deciding these things, what would you recommend that like the average person do to try to make sure that the lunch trays in their community, that the food environments in their community, and the nutrition security of their community is something that's top of mind? Is there any recommendations you would make on that?
Yeah, I would stress to students and parents to write to their school nutrition director, their food service director, and to gin up support among friends. At the end of the day, in my conversations with school nutrition professionals, they would love to incorporate more plant-based foods. It's just that they haven't seen a demonstration of buy-in to this idea. So, you know, if you want to see these foods, then you need to make your voice heard to the people who are in charge. So, you know, send your emails, call their office, um, and organize with like-minded people.
Yeah, and get in touch with us too. I mean,
Yeah.
we do this day in, day out. Like we can help you. Our institutional support team is fantastic. They're so willing, and we've seen quite a lot of successes across the country in this regard. I mean, Balance put out, you authored a fiber specific white paper talking about like guidelines on that. Maybe you could share a little bit about like the inspiration behind that paper and sort of what problems that paper solved and what solutions it offered.
Yeah. So we kind of collectively, as an organization and also as a movement, have identified that school meals are probably not sufficient in dietary fiber, and that part of that is due to the lack of plant-based proteins in lunches. So I co-authored with one of our former colleagues here at Balanced um, a white paper that essentially was kind of scouring the nutrition science literature for any information on the availability of fiber in school meals. And there's really just not a lot of research focused on fiber in school meals. So we're kind of laying out the arguments in that paper for policies that could potentially increase the amount of fiber in school meals. And so I think, still like the most effective thing that you could do would be to swap out conventional proteins with plant-based proteins. And that's also kind of the inspiration behind the research that I'm currently doing with our data scientist, Crystal. And I'm really excited for the results of that study to come in so that we can publish it and share with the world our findings.
Yeah, one of the things that, did have me a bit encouraged was I was looking at the recent MAHA report, the Making Our Children Healthy Again, and dietary fiber was mentioned like 8 times specifically in that report. So the authors, whoever, whatever they may be, um, mentioned dietary fiber deficiency within that. So I'm hopeful that as these reforms are happening, this dietary fiber conversation can continue. I know on social, I've been seeing so many people mentioning dietary fiber. You recently put out a blog post, fiber is the new protein, which is really fantastic. And we're seeing legumes being mentioned to offer fiber and resistant starches that nourish beneficial bacteria. The report was saying that whole foods rich in dietary fiber stimulate the release of key satiety hormones. So, the fiber is being mentioned, and I'm just, hopeful, maybe naively, but hopeful that we can get the inclusion of dietary fiber into these new guidelines. But it's kind of just like a waiting game. Like, we kind of just have to wait and see, and try to do our best to continue to advocate in however that looks. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I think maybe you have more hope than I do. I'm not sure if that was the same report that was AI generated. It was like,
Yeah, that's why I mentioned the
I don't
authors,
know.
like whoever or whatever they may be.
I think AI is probably what put that in there. Based on what I know about RFK Jr., I don't know that I've ever heard him mention dietary fiber. In fact, I've mentioned him, or I've heard him mention the carnivore diet several times. So that's, I mean, we'll see.
Yeah, and we're seeing the impacts of that with the increase in, cardiovascular issues related to those adhering to the carnivore diet, the increase in, like blood lipid levels. It's definitely a very unique time in regards to nutrition science, because previously, it was like cultural. People, gain nutrition knowledge over, hundreds of thousands of years of eating culturally relevant foods in small communities. And with the proliferation of, the internet, science, and nutrition science, we've seen it go in many, many different ways. And like you said, like, we have a pretty robust understanding of like the ideal establishment of what creates high quality health outcomes. So we have a pretty good baseline to go off of. So seeing how we're sort of like straying from the path in these many different ways, and with the diets sort of being paired with ideology and belief systems outside of just the nutrition science and letting science govern the behaviors, um, we're definitely going to learn the hard way as a society if we continue down this path, because the science is the science, and ideology is the ideology. So if people continue down their ideological path, we'll find out. But yeah, so hoping that in the future more high quality nutrition science is incorporated, that these folks in public positions are getting higher quality nutrition. And this is kind of like a one-off question, just kind of like a random thought, but like, how much are there any groups that are out there doing training for policymakers about nutrition science? Like, are there any events that like talk to our Congress folks and senators, or people in government positions about nutrition science, and just doing like, here's the basics? Like, are there any types of programs like that?
I have to imagine that there are some organizations who will put on briefings. It's generally briefings that are like the vehicle for educating staffers who might be interested. And also, like, I've been known to send a fact sheet or two to congressional offices that I think will actually be receptive to the things I have to say. And, that's one of the things that I'd actually like to engage more in, and over the next couple of years is to do more educational outreach to policymakers.
Yeah, I mean, I think the dividends pay off long term, not only for like building the relationships with those who are getting into these positions where they can be of influence, but also just making sure that that good information is getting out there. So, all right, well, I just wanted to say, like, thank you so much, Maddie. I know you are, deep in the policy realm of things. There's always new stuff going on, so I really appreciate you taking the time to chat with me. If folks want to get in contact with you, want to collaborate, or just, you know, learn from your expertise, how could they get in contact with you?
Yeah, well, it's been my pleasure talking with you, Chris. If anyone wants to reach out to me, my email is madelineb@balanced.org. And you can also find that information on our website. And you can also check out our blog. I'm pretty sure my email is there too. So
Yeah, essentially go to the Balance website, right?
just go to the Balance
Cool.
website.
Yeah, and there's so many resources. So if you felt inspired by this conversation, you're like, I want to do something about it, we're here to help you. Go sign up for our newsletter. We're putting out content all the time. So definitely follow us on YouTube, LinkedIn, we're on TikTok. We do a lot of cool fiber stuff over there. And yeah, whatever your social platform you're on, be sure to follow, like, comment what you liked about the conversation, comment what you didn't like about the conversation. Is there anything that we missed? We'll definitely be getting to all of those. So just thank you so much, Maddie. I really appreciate you. And we're just going to continue to keep fighting for nutrition security, trying to change menus and save lives, right?
Absolutely. Thanks, Chris.